Hello everyone, welcome to today's session where we take a close look at the short story, The Third and Final Continent by Jhumpa Lahiri. This story is part of the collection Interpreter of Maladies, Stories of Bengal, Boston and Beyond. As you all know, it won the Pulitzer Prize in the year 2000, and this work is also considered as one of the best documents which talk about the experience of immigration from India to abroad, to especially to America. And in this story, as we have noted, it talks about a particular kind of a diasporic experience, and it also gives minute details about the various things that a person and his family goes through his journey across different continents and to different countries. And I use this session to take you through some of the important aspects of this short story, some of the details which will be useful in analyzing this fiction and also in accessing particular diasporic experiences which Lahiri notes. The story begins as a first person narrator. The narrator remains unnamed, and it talks about how the narrator left India in 1964. And we get to know right at the outset that in 1964, when he first sailed to London, it was he could not use an aeroplane, and he makes a particular mention of that, how the first journey, his first international journey was in a ship. He had to sail, and the second time he goes to America, to Boston, he gets to fly. And by noting down these particular experiences, the peculiarities and the minute details, Lahiri is inviting us into a world where the details captured are very, very important. And in the beginning, at the outset itself, we also get to know about the many other penniless Bengali bachelors like the narrator, who were already there in London, and how they share the space, share a certain kind of food, and how there is an attempt right at the outset to create a certain authentic experience, create a certain kind of a home away from home. And I find it particularly interesting that the first paragraph tells us about these set of people all struggling to educate and establish ourselves abroad. So it's a very different kind of an experience of migration here. The narrator and the ones that he is familiar with, they are not going abroad just to make a living. They are not going abroad looking for a job, which also typically qualifies most of the third world migration diasporic experiences. Here it is extremely important that he is among those who are trying to go abroad to educate and establish themselves. And this goal is very clear right at the beginning in the 1960s. And the story further tells us about how he attended lectures at LSE, and we also get to know that he is a well accomplished student in that sense, and that there is a career waiting for him, and he is already trying to establish himself with these credentials. The story quickly takes us to 1969, when the narrator is 36 years old and his own marriage is arranged. In this story, though the focus is on the experience of migration, it also tells in detail about the very peculiar kind of arranged marriage that Indian families have. And the story gives an almost stereotypical kind of a presentation of an arranged Bengali marriage. And further into the story, we also see how the narrator does not talk in overwhelming terms about his marriage or the relation that he begins with his wife. It is stated in very matter-of-fact terms. In fact, he seems to be more prepared and more excited to start a career abroad, to live a new experience abroad. But he seems to be rather laid back when it comes to entering this new relationship, which happens to him in a very incidental way, and which also is presented in an ironically mundane way. And I find the segment very interesting, where he accesses the student guide to North America before flying to America. And the story also tells us a little later about how he chose to ignore his weeping wife, the newly wedded wife lying next to him, and he continues to read through the guide which would equip him for a perfect life abroad. And we are also given to understand about the ways in which he accesses inexpensive accommodation, and there are these various things that he gets done, and it is more or less a very, very smooth experience. There is a mention of food and how he also talks about the experience in Boston, in America, is very different from being in London, and this is extremely significant. He does not compare America with Calcutta, the city which he had first left behind, but the comparison now, after moving to Boston from London, the comparison is more with Boston. So from the state of comparing this, leaving behind his homeland and moving to a new city first, which is London, now he moves on to compare two very different immigration experiences. And we also find him spending 6 weeks in YMCA and waiting for his wife's passport to get ready. He takes an apartment on rent, and the apartment which he gets to take on rent, very interestingly, takes in only boys from Harvard and Tech. And it also talks about a certain kind of a world from which he is leaving from Calcutta, an educated middle class world, and how he manages to fit himself within the same kind of setting, even in an alien land, with Mrs. Croft, the apartment that he gets to rent out. We find that she's also someone who places a lot of value on education. She's very middle class, very traditional in terms of her value system, and there is a very peculiar way in which he manages to fit himself in both these worlds. And I would also like to remind you that there are a number of not so smooth, painful migration experiences that the third world residents face. But Lahiri's stories, and particularly this one, talks about this very smooth experience, which does not have any exaggerated emotions and which does not have any eventful episode, so to speak. Even that happens when he lands in America, and Boston is very significant. I'll read out this excerpt for you. As the plane began its descent over Boston Harbor, the pilot announced the weather and the time, and that President Nixon had declared a national holiday. 2 American men had landed on the moon. Several passengers cheered, "God bless America." One of them hollered, "Across the aisle I saw a woman praying." So this event, this iconic giant leap for the entire mankind as it has been described, this event continues to signify many of the things that he gets to do, especially during the earlier weeks of his stay. And as soon as he enters Mrs. Croft's home for the first time, we find this event being invoked again. I read to you this excerpt. She unclasped her fingers, slapped a space beside her on the bench with one hand, and told me to sit down. For a moment she was silent, then she intoned, as if she alone possessed this knowledge, "There is an American flag on the moon." "Yes, madam." Until then, I had not thought very much about the moonshot. It was in the newspaper, of course, article upon article. The astronauts had landed on the shores of the Sea of Tranquility, I had read, traveling farther than anyone in the history of civilization. For a few hours, they explored the moon's surface. They gathered rocks in their pockets, described their surroundings, a magnificent desolation according to one astronaut, spoke by phone to the president, and planted a flag in lunar soil. The voyage was hailed as man's most awesome achievement. The woman bellowed, "A flag on the moon, boy! I heard it on the radio. Isn't that splendid?" "Yes, madam." But she was not satisfied with my reply, and she commanded, "Say splendid." I was both baffled and somewhat insulted by the request. It reminded me of the way I was taught multiplication tables as a child, repeating after the master, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my one-room Tolkien school. It also reminded me of my wedding, when I had repeated endless Sanskrit verses after the priest, verses I barely understood, would join me to my wife. I said nothing. "Say splendid," the woman bellowed once again. "Splendid," I murmured. I had to repeat the word a second time at the top of my lungs so she could hear. I was reluctant to raise my voice to an elderly woman, but she did not appear to be offended. If anything, the reply pleased her, because the next command was, "Go see the room." And this seemingly very mundane, uneventful incident continues to be very significant in this story, because the narrator comes from a background where raising one's voice in front of elders is not considered polite. Besides, he is not the kind who can show that kind of an excitement or who can raise his voice to celebrate anything for that matter perhaps. So here, when this woman, the American woman, is asking him to say splendid in response of the image of the flag, the American flag being seen on the moon, we find him doing precisely that. And this is perhaps one of the first instances where he owns this country's, the new country's achievements as his own, and he sets out to celebrate that in a way that in a way that does not come to him very naturally. And it's interesting how he also compares this with the way he was taught multiplication tables and the way he got married, where the priest asked him to do a set of things which he did not even perhaps pay attention to. So the way he talks about his wife Mala, interestingly Mala's name is mentioned but the narrator's name is not. So the way he talks about how he got into this union with Mala is very interesting. He talks about Mala as a woman who is 27 years old and she's not fair, and her complexion is not fair, and narrator is telling us for that reason she could not get married for a long time. And this marriage, even if that meant shipping her to a different continent, as far as her parents were concerned, the narrator tells us that this was to save her from spinsterhood. And this is also a glimpse into the way arranged marriages work in India, and that is the kind of documentation that Lahiri perhaps tries to do as well. But what is a bit alarming, but what could perhaps become a little alarming of these sort of representations is that one tends to take that as the norm across communities and across different cultures, given the diversity of this nation. And very briefly, we are also told about the narrator's mother who died 6 years ago, and later in the story we find the narrator making a comparison between his own mother, who was widowed when his father died when the narrator was 16, and Mrs. Croft, who single-handedly managed to do everything until she turned 103 or so. In the last session, we did speak about the ways in which the two widowhood experiences are compared and how the narrator looks at it from two different vantage points. When Mala finally arrives in Boston, the narrator's response is not overwhelming at all, and since there was no phone, he says he had received a telegram, which also tells us about the limited possibilities in the old world. And he uses 3 words to talk about the arrival of Mala. He is not touched, it is inevitable, and it is meaningless. The event itself does not seem to signify anything at all for the narrator, because this marriage is not an event, not a significant part of his life during this phase when he is still waiting for his wife to join him in America. There is a brief excerpt just before that where he sees this Indian woman on Massachusetts Avenue. I read out that excerpt for you. I saw an Indian woman on Massachusetts Avenue wearing a sari with its free end nearly dragging on the footpath and pushing a child in a stroller. An American woman with a small black dog on a leash was walking to one side of her. Suddenly the dog began barking. I watched as the Indian woman, startled, stopped in her path, at which point the dog leaped up and seized the end of the sari between its teeth. The American woman scolded the dog, appeared to apologize, and walked quickly away, leaving the Indian woman to fix her sari and quiet her crying child. She did not see me standing there, and eventually she continued on her way. Such a mishap, I realized that morning, would soon be my concern. It was my duty to take care of Mala, to welcome her and protect her. We find this image being almost preserved intact throughout the story, the image of the ideal Indian woman who wears a sari and who refuses to move out of the sartorial code that she is used to. We find Mala also sticking to these customs, the accessories, and to the many things which would perhaps help her to retain her identity. And when Mala arrives finally, and this is the identity which the narrator also uses to describe her. At the airport, I recognized Mala immediately. The free end of her sari did not drag on the floor, but was draped in a sign of bridal modesty over her head, just as it had draped my mother until the day my father died. So the description further goes. Her thin brown arms were stacked with gold bracelets. A small red circle was painted on her forehead, and the edges of her feet were tinted with a decorative red eye. I did not embrace her or kiss her or take her hand. Instead, I asked her, speaking Bengali for the first time in America, if she was hungry. This is extremely important, the language and food. And from the beginning of the story, we realize that these are the two things which the narrator uses to create an authentic experience in a land which is far away from his homeland. Language, speaking in Bengali, being with other Bengali people, or even talking about food or having food as an experience which would bring them close or even help them retain the identity. Towards the end of the story, as we recalled in the previous session, when he's waiting for his son to come home and have rice, he's also thinking maybe after they are gone, after the parents are long dead, he may stop eating rice and stop speaking in Bengali. These two elements seem to be very integral to the ways in which the narrator and his wife, and perhaps many others who are having similar kinds of migration experiences, holding on to some kind of authenticity through language and through food. And it's interesting where they talk about the menu in the flight. The menu said oxtail soup. The thought of eating an oxtail made me lose my appetite. And there is a way in which the family gets to adapt in selective ways, and how they retain certain things like food habits or the value system or certain very, very tangible things like the pajamas or the coconut oil or the curries that they bring from home. There is always this attempt to retain the authentic flavor and to remain as Bengali as possible in multiple ways. And incidentally, the many images that we get about the narrator and his wife, they also reinforce this idea in multiple ways. We find that Mala's experience, the first experience as an immigrant, is very different from that of her husband's. He had come there with the hope of getting a good education and establishing himself in another system. Mala, on the other hand, is accompanying the narrator only because she's married to her. So there is a limited way in which her identity works. She is taking care of the house. She is taking care of the domestic chores, the domestic affairs. The first time she goes out to buy a peeler, a vegetable peeler, and also to get some fresh garlic, to buy a good tablecloth. These are the different ways in which she tries to establish himself in this new place. It is entirely different from the ambitions that the narrator has. We do not, of course, find him talking a lot about his career or the kind of work that he ended up doing for 30 years in America. But nevertheless, we get to know that there is a certain way in which he has managed to find his roots, however superficial they are, in this alien land, because his son, he has adapted well into this new world. He's attending Harvard, and we also suspect that he will soon become more American than Bengali, because the only two things which are Bengali about him are the rice that he has occasionally when he comes home, and the Bengali that they speak at home within the family. So the instance where he says the distance between them lessened is also very interesting. He's taking Mala to visit Mrs. Croft, the house where he lived for about 6 weeks, and this is how the narrator describes Mala's experience in Mrs. Croft's home. "Who's she, boy?" "She's my wife, madam." Mrs. Croft pressed her head at an angle against the cushion to get a better look. "Can you play the piano?" "No, madam," Mala replied. "Then stand up." Mala rose to her feet, adjusting the end of her sari over her head and holding it to her chest, and for the first time since her arrival, I felt sympathy. I remembered my first days in London, learning how to take the tube to Russell Square, riding an escalator for the first time, unable to understand that when the man cried Piper, it meant paper, unable to decipher for a whole year that the conductor said, mind the gap, as the train pulled away from each station. Like me, Mala had travelled far from home, not knowing where she was going or what she would find, for no reason other than to be my wife. As strange as it seemed, I knew in my heart that one day her death would affect me, and stranger still that mine would affect her. And I wanted somehow to explain this to Mrs. Croft, who was still scrutinizing Mala from top to toe with what seemed to be placid disdain. I wondered if Mrs. Croft had ever seen a woman in a sari with a dot painted on her forehead and bracelets stacked on her wrists. I wondered what she would object to. I wondered if she could see the red dye still vivid on Mala's feet, all but obscured by the bottom edge of her sari. At last, Mrs. Croft declared, with the equal measures of disbelief and delight I knew well, she is a perfect lady. So, this instance plays a significant role in bringing them closer. He says, so for the first time we looked at each other and smiled. I like to think of that moment in Mrs. Croft's parlour as the moment when the distance between Mala and me began to lessen. We don't even know whether subconsciously the narrator also sees this as a sign of approval. Mrs. Croft, the American woman who gave him an apartment to stay, the American woman whom he looks at as this fiercely independent woman with strong values, who is able to say splendid at the thought of the American flag on the moon. We don't know whether he is seeing this as some kind of a legitimate approval that he gets for his wife. And taking us to the present, he says, I have not strayed much farther. Mala and I live in a town about 20 miles from Boston on a tree-lined street, much like Mrs. Croft's. We visit Calcutta every few years, but we've decided to grow old here. I work in a small college library. We have a son who attends Harvard University. Mala no longer drapes the end of her sari over her head or weeps at night for her parents, but occasionally she weeps for our son. So this is the way he sums up his life at the end of 30 years. And he tells us about how Mrs. Croft's street, street and a home where she lived until she was 103. They continue to see the street and smile and remember that there was ever a time that we were strangers. And when the story ends, significantly, this experience is more about the narrators. And significantly, when the story ends, this experience is more about the narrator and his sons, and it is less and less about Mala herself. It's less and less about how she came there and how she managed to adapt and make a life there. It is more about what the narrator thinks he had achieved. I'll read out the final segment. In my son's eyes, I see the ambition that had first hurled me across the world. In a few years, he will graduate and pay his own way, alone and unprotected. But I remind myself that he has a father who is still living, a mother who is happy and strong. Whenever he is discouraged, I tell him that if I can survive on 3 continents, then there is no obstacle he cannot conquer. While we are astronauts, heroes forever, spent mere hours on the moon, I have remained in this new world for nearly 30 years. I know that my achievement is quite ordinary. I am not the only man to seek his fortune far from home. And certainly I am not the first. Though there are times I am bewildered by each mile I have travelled, each meal I have eaten, each person I have known, each room in which I have slept. As ordinary as it all happens, there are times when it is beyond my imagination. And this is how he ends this narrative. He compares himself to the astronauts, recalling the event which happened on the day when he landed in Boston. The day he landed in Boston, the Americans, they had landed and had placed an American flag on the moon. So that is the way in which he tries to see his achievement as being no lesser than the astronauts' achievement itself. And he thinks he is better off because they had spent merely hours on the moon, and he has managed to spend years, the first 4 to 5 years in London, and then another 30 plus long years in another strange land in America. As we wrap up this discussion, I also want to remind I also want you to remember and notice how uncomplicated, how smooth this process of migration seems like, this process of immigration seems like. And perhaps Lahiri is doing this very deliberately to document the uncomplicated, the smooth experience of migration that a middle class educated Indian has when he goes into another first world in pursuit of good education, and also with the intention of establishing himself within that new system, that new society. But this really does not embody most third world experiences of migration. And not to say that the story should talk about everything, but again drawing attention to the many smaller details and the bigger events that the story chooses to not speak about. In fact, the complexity of the story also lies in those unspoken things about how the narrator's own subject position allowed him to overlook the many little things and the bigger things which were happening in America. As we spoke about, America is going through this phase where Vietnam War is happening, but we do not find the narrator getting disturbed by any of those things. Or in 1964, when he is leaving Calcutta, the Calcutta riots are happening. So we do not find his subject, we do not find his selfhood being affected by any of these things. So as we wrap up this discussion, I also want you to think about how there is an unnamed narrator in Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, and the kind of experience that narrator in Shadow Lines has. Both of them are Bengalis, and we find the Shadow Lines protagonist having a very different experience. He stays rooted, tries to be authentic, he tries to connect with home through the many incidents and events which are significant in shaping the political history of the nation, and also in redefining the subjecthood, the selfhood that he occupies. On that note, I again encourage you to read the story on your own. I hope this will also give you an entry point to access more other writings on diasporic experiences, and also to see how differently they are narrated in order to present a peculiar kind of narrative that the story tries to foreground. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.